Testing 1, 2, 3.
Yeah, another sound. Did you get in? The code right away is 310, then the no, but anything else.
No, tell them no more interrupting, please.
And then the bell, yeah. The bell, yeah.
We'll be starting in 1 moment. Sorry, I just don't want to have interruptions. Shmulek?
Hello.
We're on the air. You're calling, and let's go. Show them waiting for our dear Shmulek here. Right. This is the shir on the Parashat Shemini and Parashat Porah, Tovshin Ayin Vav. We did not have a shir over Shabbos, and because of that, what I'd like to do is at least to bring out some of the inyanim in a very brief shir instead of our normal, very long presented to a full audience, and assuming a knowledge of most of the issues from previous shirim, being as there's no one here to have to explain it to. So hopefully we can do it much more efficiently than we normally do. You don't need explanations. That's the point. So if it's a popular audience, they're not familiar, they need explanations. So what we have over here is a parsha in Shemini that expresses a profound paradox in the nature, clearly, of Bria itself. Because as Chazal tell us, this Yom HaShmini is really the idea of completely new beginning. This is a Yom Shem with Notel Eser Atarot, and as Shemini always is. Shemini is the nature of Bris Milah. Because of that, it's post-Bria. And as a matter of fact, there's an Orach Chaim who brings here something that he found very shocking, and he doesn't see why it's here. And that's when Moshe Rabbeinu comes and tells Aaron, Zeh Davar Asher, Zadavar is a reference to Mila. Just what does that have to do with here? But we'll see that it has everything to do with here, and that basically the Yom HaShmini, which begins a world that is populated by Adam, who has an Aveda, and who now expresses the Hashabara Elohim La'asos of my separations. So this is now the first day of that new world. And because of that, the Medrash tells us that there was Simcha Lifnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu on this day, Ki Yom Shenivru Bo Shamayim V'Aretz. And therefore, the astounding destruction of the day with such a strange callousness in which we continue on as if nothing has happened. You pass me the Chumash, maybe get that smaller one volume Chumash that Shmuel will be able to. It was right here this morning.
I know.
So this is the Zeh Davar Shetzivah Hashem Ta'asu, says the Orach Chaim, Boli Adi Medrash Chazal, Zeh Lashon Zeh Davar, Mao Zeh Davar Al Mila, Kebodetim Zeh Davar Shemal Yehoshua, Ad Kan, V'divrei HaMidrash, Situmim V'chatumim, V'chiboto Moshe Malot, Oto Yom Malot HaMoshe, V'boto Yom Tzivah HaMila. Fine. But now getting back to the structure of the parsha. So we have Vayikra Aaron al Mizbeach, Vishchat Egel HaChatat, Vayakrivu Bnei Aaron et Adam Elav, Vayichatz et HaKerev et HaKra'im, and we go through the whole thing. Everything is very straightforward. Vatetze Eish Milifnei Hashem, Vatochal al Mizbeach et Olav et Chalavim, Vayar Kolam Vayaronu Vayiplu al Pneihem, and then we have immediately following Vatetze Eish Milifnei Hashem Vatochal otam, the Shnei Bnei Aaron, Vayamutu Lifnei Hashem, and then Moshe says, okay, we'll just get them out of here so that it doesn't, destroy the wedding. It's Moshe, so there's a mace at Chasna. So he grabbed Moshe L'bnei Shaul Tzafan, get them out. Su'at Achecha Me'et Bnei HaKodesh, Michutz L'Machaneh. We don't want the celebrations here to be ruined. We don't ruin the ceremony over here. The show must go on. So then we go directly to Petach HaMoed, Lotetzeo, and the continued mitzvahs of the Kahuna. And it's it's just something that is difficult to see how it is that we could possibly talk about the show must go on when Lamai says, the Medrash tells us, that this is a horrifying element of Ma'aseh Bereshis itself. And the idea of its being an element of Ma'aseh Bereshis itself is the way the Tanchuma puts it, that Vayiba Yom HaShmini, Amarti L'Olamim Al Ta'olu, V'Rishoyim Al Tarimu Keren. And basically, this is the way it is in the world, says the Medrash. Lo kol mi shesameach hayom, sameach l'machar. You want to know how profound this is? When was that? By Briyat HaOlam. Exactly what this day is supposed to be, right? So, כשברא הקדוש ברוך הוא את עולמו, הייתה שמחה גדולה לפניו, שם יכבוד השם לעולם, ישמח השם במעשיו. וירא אלוהים את כל אשר עשה, והנה טוב מאוד, everything is great, לעולם זה כשהיה הקדוש ברוך הוא מתגאה, משתבח, במעשיו מאוד, and boom, the whole thing is kaput within a couple of hours. He's sholach ונתן לו אפופיסין, עפר אתה, על עפר תשוב, וכביכול הוא המתין בשמחתו. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu, in the very Ma'aseh Bereshis, which is the whole basis of Vayiba Yom HaShmini, which is the Simcha of the HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Shenamar Yismar Hashem HaMa'aseh. Then obviously we're talking about something which is fundamental in Ma'aseh Bereshis itself. What's more, the Medrash also points out that Yismach Hashem b'ma'asav, Samach Hashem b'ma'asav lo ne'emar, el Yismach Hashem b'ma'asav. Just as it says, Yismach Yisrael ba'osav. Doesn't say Samach Yisrael ba'osav, Yismach. So in other words, all of this simcha, the elements of simcha, even in Ma'aseh Bereshis, are meant to be latit lavo, and are not part of the current reality. I mean, the I think strongest expression of the idea of how much this is part not of the incidental, the way things happen to work out at the time, but are part of the fundamental reality, is the fact that the Torah offers us no cogent explanation for what it was exactly that Nadav Avihu did. And I mean, there's so many contradictions. We can focus on the Eish Zara. We could focus on the Knisa that was without Rishus, because that too comes out later. That Zot Yavo Aaron, Yavo B'chol Eitel HaKodesh, but then we have Yain V'Shechar Al Tesh, and of course we have all of the other inyonim that Chazal are medayik, so that the Emot Hayamutu Shnei Hazakenim Alo, and Lo Natlu Ish Machtato, Lo Natlu Eitza Zum Niso, and they weren't married, and they said nobody is Roy for us, and therefore they couldn't possibly handle the Keteret. And I mean, there's literally dozens and dozens of reasons, which points in the most horrific way. I mean, it's really the way the Medrash brings it out really beautifully by showing how it appears to everybody to be completely and totally like arbitrary, out of the left field, which nobody is expecting. It's in Moshe Lamad Over. A king comes into town, there's a glorious procession, and he's got his top guys next to him, behind him, Secret Service all around, and everybody's marching through and throwing confetti. All of a sudden, the king turns around, takes out a revolver, and shoots his top guy. As he was walking down Fifth Avenue, looking in the windows, everybody, what just happened? Nobody knows. Afterwards, when they get to the palace, the king says, listen, I don't want anybody to look at windows when we're walking around the street. Oh, so it must have been a window. There's anything over here? Kodesh Baruch Hu says, Yain V'Shechar Al Tesh. Oh, it must be that they went and should do Yain. Of course, it's not what it says in the Pasuk. It says that they were Makriv Eish Zora. Very, very confusing, but it serves to bring out so powerfully that the issue is not the specific. The issue is the Ritzon Chaledah. The issue is that we're talking about here at Hakomas HaMishkan something that involves the basis of Simcha and loss of Simcha in Ma'aser Bereishis as a whole. And what's remarkable is that the issue revolves not only around Ma'aser Bereishis, but around the concept of Chet and the need for Yom Kippurim and the tikkun of the ego. And this becomes, of course, as Ramban points out, all of these korbanos that are brought here become the korbanos really of Yom Kippurim. And the idea of Yom Kippurim is Achrei Mot Shnei Bnei Aaron. And the Shnei Seirim of Yom Kippurim are connected, as the Zohar says, to be able to be, if you could be married to Moses on Shnei Bnei Aaron, that's the equivalent of the Akrav of the Shnei Seirim. That's wild. Because that, of course, is the day that is B'chapra on the Egel, the same way that the Mishkan is meant to incorporate the Egel. And for heaven's sakes, what is the other sugya? Well, we know what the other sugya is because it says so good for the Gemara and Yuma. So, Kasher Tziva Hashem. Today, Shiva Simei that's Tziva Hashem La'asot. And what is that? Yom Kippurim and Purim. So both of them require the Shivas Yom Kippurim, the Achon of the Kohen Gadol. Parah Aduma. The mitzvah Parah Aduma was given. Zos Chukas Torah was said on Shemini L'Miluim. So obviously there's a profound connection here that is not simply, it happens to be that it worked out. And this year we have Parah and Shemini. Parah essentially is Shemini. It was said on Shemini. It relates to exactly the same issues as Shemini because, of course, as Rashi tells us at the beginning of Chukas, that we're talking about over here, the tikkun of the ego, which was the makor of mortality. That tikkun of the ego meant bring the mother and let the mother clean up the mess. Moshe Lamad Oradena, a shivchul brought the baby into the palace, baby vomited all over the place. Said the king, let the mother come and clean up. Same thing over here, let the Parah clean up the mess that was made by the ego. Of course, this entire parsha revolves around the ego. The chashash that Aaron had that the Shekhinah wasn't being yored. The fact that Moshe and Aaron had to be nichnas because Moshe needed to be mispalel. the relationship here between Moshe and Aaron, which is unique. And as Rashi brings, Moshe, my dear brother Moshe, how could you do this to me? I know the Shekhinah isn't being heard because of me. And Aaron was Bosh, and he didn't want to come to the Mizbeach. And Moshe tells him, on the simple level, it sounds a little bit silly. Lamata Bosh, Lakach, Nivcharta, as Rashi says, but the deeper element is, obviously, he was Bosh because he felt that, as the Medrash says, that the Ramban describes, and Rabbi Nabachi describes, the Medrash says Aaron looked at the Mizbeach and all he could see was the angel. Obviously, he didn't want to come up to the Mizbeach. That was so much his entire psychology of everything that was taking place, was that he couldn't bring himself to go up, in which case we could understand the words. Lama ta bosh lakach nivcharta is gufa, meant as the reason that you were nivchar is because you're the only one who can handle the purpose of Mishkan in terms of utilizing Egel for Aveda. As we know, the Mishkan incorporated the Egel and the Yitzra of Avedas Kechovim, Bechlal, in the Kodesh HaKadoshim, which became the mocker of our Aveda Shamayim. So there's some obvious fundamental paradox here, which is Nogea, the issue of death itself. That's the Zot Chukas Torah, the ultimate paradox in which Brias Ha'elam and the Simcha of HaKadosh Baruch Hu must relate in the Afafusim of Adam. The Afafusim of Adam here, as the Rabbi Nabachi explained, Aaron is Keneged Adam. And Aaron is the one who is the Oved and the Makir and the Miyachir, exactly as Adam is meant to be in Ma'aser Bereishis. And Adam has to be Neitel, this element of the Klolos of Gan Eden. And so too, Aaron over here, that Kadosh Baruch Hu, as Rashi brings it, Moshe Rabbeinu says the original Gezer against Aaron was Lashkito, which means the destruction of his children. And that Moshe Rabbeinu's tefillah saved them from half, which later on becomes part of an entire pattern of half in the Ser Lazazel and the Ser Mishtalech, which we'll talk about later on. But the point is that the two inyanim deal with that same story of paradox, and this paradox itself must relate not stam to the fact that it happened to be Yom HaShmini, but they're added to the nature of the Mishkan itself. We've already seen that Mishkan is Mashkan, as it says, the Mishkan HaEdus, which is Mechaper on the Egel, is Mishkan HaEdus, the Nipukudei HaMishkan. And that means that double nature, which is Pekudei itself, which is the Lashon of Pekudei. So as the Ramban points out, that concept of Pekudei in Bechlal always relates to that care, and apparently has the same double nature as the word Mishkan itself, as Mashkan, which is why in Haftarah, we find that exactly the same thing happens at Peretz Be'uza, and that's what it's all about. So that Peretz Be'uza event was exactly, everybody is happy, everybody's dancing, we're bringing the Oren Abris up to Yerushalayim, pow, for no immediately visible reason, until finally David HaMelech has to figure out what went wrong over here. And that itself, of course, is a tremendous contrast of the nature of a Mishkan of Anti Shitim Eibzin, in which everything lives forever, even the behemoths that were used to pull the agolas, and yet the Adam isn't zeicha to become part of that Amida Li'olam, to such a profound extent that what we spoke of as the deepest aveilus of Tisha B'Av was a tremendous lesson, that the concept of Tisha B'Av is to begin before Tisha B'Av, not to respond to Tisha B'Av. And that's the entire idea of the Misha Nichnasav, and the understanding of it's the unhappiness that leads to Tisha B'Av, not vice versa, is here part of the whole meaning of the Shivas Yemei HaMiluim. As the Medrash says, that's the Shemer Mitzvah Lo Yedad Avara. Moshe Rabbeinu was suspicious from the beginning. So what is the Shivas Yamim? The only other time that this happened was immediately before the Mabul, where HaKadosh Baruch Hu there was Yoshev Shiva Al, knowing that something horrible was coming. And here too, we need to be very zoyer. Something horrible is coming. And that means that in the actual Miluim, that brings the Kedusha to the Mishkan. L'Doros. That same Miluim incorporated the idea of the Avelut, which would become the Bechia L'Doros, and would teach us how it is that we need to deal with the idea of Avelut as being built in to the nature of our reality. And that means the Ritzoncha Teda, the investiture. You want to know to what extent this is? Maisa Bereshis has to incorporate Avelut. Mishkan has to incorporate Avelut. The beginning of the new world in the Yom HaShmini is about Avelut. And this idea, this numbing inevitability, in which, understand, we're talking about this before. I mean, it's all the spontaneous reaction. But we know it wasn't a spontaneous reaction because we know that there was a problem in the breakdown of the Gvulais on Maimed Har Sinai, which were caused by Nadav Avihu, as Chazal tells us, that idea should have resulted at that moment in their death. El Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, listen, today's the chassid of my daughter. The Torah is getting married. I don't want to ruin this wedding. But here too, we use that same metaphor as wedding, right? So here too, says HaKadosh Baruch Hu, this is my wedding. This is B'yom Chatunato, B'yom Simchat Libo, V'yorado Dilagano. I'd rather ruin my wedding in my simcha. And therefore I'll wait until Shemini B'miluim. So that the idea of the spontaneity and the sudden Vayetzeyesh B'vnei Hashem is nothing at all as spontaneous as you would think. The inevitability of the Shivas Yomim is saying this is the way it has to be. Whether you trace it back to Har Sinai and the Gvulos or whatever it is, looking into shop windows or drinking wine, which of course is itself an amazing paradoxical nature, just as Simcha itself is. And this is the Gemara points out. This is the steer in the entire nature of Simcha. On the one hand, it's V'shibachti Anieta Simcha. And on the other, it is V'simcha Mazos. And that's exactly what happens here by Peretz Be'uza. The very Peretz Be'uza, which became a tremendous pagam in the nature of that original Aliyah and in the Simcha of David at the time, became the Makor of David HaMelech's discovery of the nature of Simcha, which now becomes Simcha L'Doros, so that it becomes the paradigm of the nature of Simcha to the Rambam Hilchos Lulav, who brings every last aspect of the way that David is mefazer, mekaker b'fnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And in fact, the end of the Haftarah, if it hadn't been in Parshas Parah, would have described the more detailed question of the contrast between the nature of Busha itself, which of course takes us all the way back to Maimed Har Sinai, to Gan Eden itself, to the original Yismach Hashem Masav, where over there the Pagam, as Chazal tell us, is in the Veloyid Boshashu. And that became the opening to the Nochash, which then became on Har Sinai, the same sense of the breakdown in Hakaras Teva, of you being B'nei Kviyei Tova, B'nei Kviyei Tova, which then becomes, in the end, the Maisa Ego, the loss of the Gvulos, which means that the question at the end of the Haftarah, the difference between the Busha of Shaul, which was the Busha of Shaul was sufficient to be able to create Esther, which was the tikkun of the restoration of mortality on Har Sinai. And in the end, that Busha of Esther becomes the Kiblu HaYehudim, which is the tikkun of the Kofalei Marchagigis on Har Sinai. And nonetheless, at the end of the Haftarah, we find the contrast in David's words to Michal, as Chazal tell us, that Kol Ma She'asa Shaul Avicha was all Chod Atzmo Darash, and I'm very happy to be without anything. I would love to be part of the chambermaids that you like to be sniff about with your hoity-toity fashion. So I would gladly work in the kitchen. Amazing. So we have the concept of the wine itself here, the fact that Nadav Avihu, according to the Zohar, walked in with the wine that was from the shtil of Gan Eden itself, in the same way that Noach had done, and they were convinced that they could be misakin. The Chet of Adam Arisha. So all of this, so much for the spontaneity of everything that took place over here. So Zohar points out, where do you think they got wine from? Well, they happened to walk into the Beis Hamikdash. They just found wine over there. And the whole point was that the entire thing was a plan that went back to the tikkun of the essence of Ra, and they messed up with that tikkun. So all of that is absolutely astonishing. And I mean, you see that Moshe Rabbeinu, speaking of inevitability, Moshe Rabbeinu says, Aaron Achi, I knew that something terrible was going to happen because Hashem, B'Krovaya Kadesh. Of course, nowhere did Hashem say those words, B'Krovaya Kadesh. But at any event, he says, but that was the meaning of V'Nigdash B'Chvodi, How exactly? V'Nigdash B'Chvodi, which B'Pashtus means the Mishkan will become Kodesh with the presence of my Shekhinah. And how in the world does that translate into B'Krovaya Kadesh? I mean, it's absolutely weird. Who would have read it that way? And then to say it, I mean, it sounds like a fairy tale. Then Moshe Rabbeinu to tell Aaron, I was convinced it would be either me or you. I thought we were the best ones to be B'Krovaya Kadesh. Now I see that they are greater than both of us. What is that supposed to mean, you folks? I understand. If you yourself were Shomer Mitzvah Lo Yeda Davara, as the Medrash says, Moshe Rabbeinu understood from the beginning that this is the Shmir, the Shivas Yimei Avelos, and that's going to protect them from Ra. So why is it inevitable? Why are we talking about it? I knew it had to be, but I thought it would be near you. And you literally mean that now they're greater than you and of me. Why? So this shocking sense of inevitability in the structures of Shemini Lumelui, in the Parents Be'uza, in Ma'aser Bereshis and Gan Eden, in Arba Nichlasula Pardes, in the fact that you can understand and be killed by what you understand, such as the Tinaik and Chashmal, and the story in the Gemara in the Chagiga, or such as the relationship of the sun and the moon. And of course, that became the very carbon that Darash Moshe, because it was that contradiction where HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, you're right, it's a paradox. Does it make sense that the one who says the right thing is the one that only the good die young? Which of course is what happens over here. What happens to that kapora? Vinei Soraf. Moshe yells, what? What Vinei Soraf? How could that be? Kasher Tziva Hashem, Kasher Tzveiti, Kasher Tziva. What's going on? And then, of course, we run into that same question. Sha'ah v'dorot. If you heard about Kodshe Sha'ah, did you hear about Kodshe Dorot? But that whole interrelationship of the instant to the totality of the picture is, strangely enough, the element of Torah. Yes, indeed. Because if you think about Paras, we've seen Parah over the past few years as being something that, as the world develops, becomes more and more clear as a davar poshet. Instead of Amartech Kama V'Rechoka, it suddenly touches on the closest expression of the nature of exactly this paradox in our psyche, in our biological evolution, and in the relationship of Sha'ah L'Dorot, for the very simple reason that what the problem of Parah raises is obviously the deepest paradox of the relationship of genotype to phenotype. We know that we can only be an organism if we are capable of being the expression of information of the most astounding complexity that has taken billions of years to develop. The only way that that information developed was through death. In other words, the idea of the programming for death by the very genes that ultimately provide for each of us as a vector for the propagation of those genes and for the keeping the information intact, which of course was the original Yisbach Hashem b'ma'asav, because the Yisbach Hashem b'ma'asav was the fact that the Deshoyim were no sekal v'chomer ba'atzman, that they need to protect their genetic information, and they cannot freely exchange genes, which is what was happening until that time. So they made a kal v'chomer from the Yulamot. It's an amazing thing. So that means the original steer in the Yisbach Hashem b'ma'asav, which of course occurs directly in the same pasuk of the breakdown in the Tama Eitz Ketama Pri of the Eitzim in Gan Eden. That is the Yisbach Hashem b'ma'asav, which now the Medrash points out is going to have to wait for its full simcha, because ain't simcha mamtenes or tzon chalida, even to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That contradiction of looking at our lives from the point of view of me, you, as an organism, as a specific phenotype, who is convinced that we are the be-all and end-all of all of these billions of years, in which Bishvili Nivra Olam, and it is wonderful me that is essentially the purpose of all of this, so that I should be Zoch and I should be Eved. Meanwhile, if we could pretend that our genes have personalities, they'd be sitting and laughing at each other and nudging the silly vector that we manufactured in order to make sure that it can inject us into the next generation. He thinks it's about him. Imagine. Incredible. If it was about him, why does he think we programmed him to drop dead just as he finishes his reproductive capacity? Never occurs to him. Not too bright, is he? So the entire idea, of course, that allowed for the development of all of this information in the first place is by making certain that the generation which generates should not degenerate into the breakdowns that happen if they live too long. And therefore, that's exactly amazingly what Reish Lakish says. That was the point of the ego. Well, v'nakir tova lavesenu, that they made the ego. Imagine if they wouldn't have made the ego. What would we worth? Nothing would ever be new. Well, I'm going to say a chiddush in front of Moshe Rabbeinu. Hey, Moshe Rabbeinu, I just thought of a great chiddush. Yes, little boy. What is your chiddush? Says 3,000-year-old Moshe Rabbeinu to little boy. I'm going to tell him what my chiddush is. I mean, come on. We wouldn't be worth anything. And nobody would die. That's all we need. Thank heavens we programmed to knock them off. But of course, that's what none of our viewers were saying. When are these guys going to die already so we can get moving? But that's exactly Pura. It's amazing that the sugyas are completely and totally intertwined. Astounding. That pain of recognizing that it's only possible to be us if, Lamaisa, there's no such thing as Simcha Mamtenet. Because at that moment, of course, everything will come to an end. If I'm going to live forever, then nothing new is ever going to happen. And therefore, we would destroy the world. Essentially, that was Nimrod's idea, you know? That's the Anshe Hashem. That's the Safacha. That's the Dvarim Achadi. Let everybody think the same thing, be the same thing, which results in the end, surprisingly, to the fact that there is no me, because all things become generic. So if I want to have the uniqueness of being me, it is absolutely essential to take the path of Avram and not of Nimrod. But that means, by definition, we're going down the road of the Ema Chashecha, Gedola, Daifelas, and Golos, and Tikkun, and so on and so forth, all of which is part of this Avelus and this Tisha B'Av. And this is surprising because this is so much part of our psychology that it becomes not only the strange double nature of wine, in which Tnu Sheichar Loved and Yain is Samach Lavavenosh, of the Zacha Nasa Rosh, Tirosh, Lo Zacha Nasa Rosh. The fact that the very wine over here, which destroyed the Mechitzes, becomes for us the Makor of Havdalah. We have a mitzvah to do Havdalah with wine. That's crazy. Here, destroyed Havdalah. This strange double nature of Tznius, the same double nature of Simcha, and remarkably, the mitzvah of Lo Taturo, which has such an amazing double nature that it completely represents the two elements that are part of phenotype and genotype, in the sense that believing that the world is all about me is what leads to meanness. So the lo taturu acharei levavchem is basically, I have my own ideas about the way things are, about the way that things should be. And this is that anything that comes into your heart, I mean, after all, you are the be all and end all of all things. And this is the arrogance that we find in academia and the put downs and the entire approach of postmodernism to all things being nothing but expressions of the way it is that I want to look at it. And then the other lotatur is exactly the opposite. The other lotatur of acharei nechem is all about sex, hedonism. But that, I mean, isn't that the opposite of the intellectual, of the idea of levavchem, of these thoughts? I mean, it's Gufa saying, no, it's the generic that's important, you know? It's the presence of the possibility of pleasure, and that's exactly the opposite. One looks at all things as if they're nothing but a matrix for the emergence of oneself. The other one says, on the contrary, look at the process. The process is an entirely sexual development. It's completely generic. It's available to use as you see fit. It's available to waste. It becomes nothing but the Kuriros of Keri, as opposed to the whole idea of the Vayikra, and represents deeply and profoundly the difference between Bilam and Moshe Rabbeinu, as we spoke about before. So this is the exact opposite of Yokar Be'inei Hashem, and becomes Reik and becomes Keri. And that means that these two elements are as profoundly interrelated as the Vayikra and the Vayikar that begin the Sefer. Such that Yom HaShmini brings out the most profound elements of this paradox. And yet, discussing paradox does not in any way explain the nature of inevitability or what it would mean, why it is that we find the paradox being the only way to go in terms of creating a Mishkan, in terms of creating a world, in terms of creating a paraduma, in terms of dealing with the problem. What exactly lies behind all of these things? So I think here that the answer actually lies in the fact that Chazal identified the original problem as part of the Yechazot Orim Vayachlu V'Yishtu, which you will notice in terms of the violation of Mechitzes, deals directly with exactly the same type of surprising, paradoxical similarity between masochism and sadism. In other words, the question of your violation of Mechitzes can be an act in which you lose yourself, such as what happens over here to Nadav Avihu or Meisif Aval Avas in the Lashon of the Medrash, and the way the Zohar speaks of it. So that despite the fact that that violation becomes a violation of Kaviyachol, in which Ubachat Aviv et Ima, and that we were over, as the Zohar says, that we were over our rayas with the Torah, so to speak, with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's the Bachtat Aviv et Ima. But the deeper Nekuda is that it's the same thing. Whether a person chooses to take over Ki'ilu, the nature of the Shechina, by becoming bottled to it and losing himself, or vice versa, taking over by making the Shechina bottled to himself, and by being the grand Shliach of the Lord, it's exactly the same thing. It's just a question of the momentary psychological expression of that joy. And it's because of that in Lamaisa, in psychological reality and in real time relationships, sadism and masochism are basically the same and can simply switch positions. And so I think if we take a look back at those Gvulais, and we know that the Gvulais were the most incredibly important part of the nature of Maimon Har Sinai, because it becomes the equivalent of the actual Dibrais, as we saw at the beginning of the Aseret Advarim in Yisro. HaKadosh Baruch Hu comes to Moshe and Vayadaber Elohim, and you're ready to listen to Anochi Hashem Elokecha, and instead HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, Lech Raid, which of course becomes the Egel ultimately, and tell the Yam, be very careful. Moshe is shocked. What? Lo yuchalam la'alot al Har Sinai. You said that they can't. I don't care. Go back down there and tell them again. Make sure that the gvulot are electrified fences. Make sure that there's sound effects associated. Do not come close. Do not come close. What is this? Now, obviously, it means that the nature of those gvulos themselves has a certain paradoxical nature. In other words, there are gvulot that have to do with the nature of being. And then there's gvulot that we talk about in terms of the respectfulness of a relationship, to maintain boundaries, which is a use of the word of gvulot whose real meaning are existential gvulot. And when we deal with a paradox of an existential nature, which is what we're dealing with over here, that is to say, with the nature of my separations itself. When I say that, I mean any time that we're dealing with the nature of something that allows the existence of something else, whatever that is, whether it's the Mishkan and the Shekhinah that come mitoich the Olam as a whole, whether we're dealing with the relationship of Shabbos that comes from Chol, or Yesh that comes from Ayin, or phenotype that comes from genotype, there's always going to be the same pattern that we find in my separations about the strange relationship of the Vayechu Hashemayim V'Aretz V'Chol Tzva'am on Yom HaShishi, and Vayechal Elohim, which is the Vayechal Elohim by Yom HaShvi'i. How is that possible? And here, I think, is where we find the key to the solution. Because we know the very strange Rashi that brings Rabbi Shimon's approach. So this is back in Bereshit. How is it possible to say on the one hand, B'Yom HaShishi, and on the other hand, B'Yom HaShvi'i? So Rabbi Shimon Omer, says Rashi, Boser v'dam, she'ino yodea itav urga'av, tzarich losif michol al HaKadosh. Aval HaKadosh Baruch Hu, she'yodea itav urga'av, nichnas po kechut hasa'ara, and that kechut hasa'ara makes it sounds like all he's saying is that kechut hasa'ara makes it appear as if HaKadosh Baruch Hu was actually nichnas into Yom HaShvi, and because of that it says Vayechal Elohim b'Yom HaShvi. But if it wasn't that, why does it say that? I mean, because we don't know. It's what Shema Yitu, it's Takdine Paro. I understand. He's not talking to Paro. He's telling us this is the Metzias. So he's telling us this is Metzias. Why does it say Vayechal b'Yom HaShvi? What kind of answer is this? A very, very strange answer. I mean, how could it just be the way that something looks? You know, it's interesting that when we say Kiddush, it's become the minhag to say Yom HaShishi, Vayechul HaShamayim V'Aretz V'Chol Tzva'am V'Chalon V'Yom HaShvi'i, as if to bring this out. That's even a problem. It's not supposed to say part of the pasuk. It's as if I say Vayer Vayivoker Yom HaShishi. But the point is that what we're trying to say is not the Vayivoker Yom HaShishi, but rather, did you notice that Yom HaShishi was Vayechul HaShamayim V'Aretz V'Chol Tzva'am? So how do you understand Vayechalon V'Yom HaShvi'i? So it becomes part of the nature of Kiddush, which of course is one mitzvah of Kiddush v'Havdalah. That was big mavdil from Chol to Kodesh, the way we're mavdil from Kodesh to Chol. And that Havdalah includes this word as the key to understanding how that has something to do with the nature of the strange gvulos that seem not to be gvulos, because it's nichnas, echad l'shini. That's a pella. And we should include that mamish in the nature of Kiddush itself. So clearly the idea over here is that when Moshe Rabbeinu says, Hu asher diber Hashem, and in his mind, v'nigdash b'chvodi equals b'krovai HaKadosh, then therein lies the key for us to understand what he is hearing in v'nigdash b'chvodi. So I would suggest that the same way that B'nigdash, in terms of the Kedushas Shekhinah, in terms of Shabbos Bereshis, over there becomes Kechut HaSa'ara. Notice that all Havdalah here in this parsha, as Rashi says, is Kechut HaSa'ara. V'ivdalta ben Adamei ben Ator. That's Kechut HaSa'ara. The idea of Sevivav Nis'ara Me'od, which is the very Pegia and Nadav view, that the closer that you get to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, note Bikrovai, the more Karov you get to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, you become closer to Sevivav. But Sevivav is Nis'ara Ma'od, Loshen of Sa'ara. It's very stormy. You can get yourself destroyed by a lightning strike, which is what happens to the child who is Mevin B'Chashmal. But it also means, as Chazal say, Vayan Hashem et Iyov min Sa'ara. It meant storm, but also means from the Chut HaSa'ara. And he tells Iyov, the Sa'ara is the key to everything. Each Sa'ara has its own Mokra Yanika. Divisions are divisions of Sa'ara. So this idea of Kechut HaSa'ara becomes the sense in Ma'aseh Bereishis, as Rashi says, HaKadosh Baruch Hu Yodea Yitav V'Raga'av Nichnas Bo Kechut HaSa'ara. Now what does that have to do with our union of Havdalah? I'll tell you exactly what it has. The truth is that every level of these paradoxical issues, all of them, everything that's connected to over here, is obvious, and it's something that Bnei Yisrael understand when they say later, after Kol HaKarav, the Mishkan Hashem is going to be killed. Karav, B'Krovai HaKadosh. The inevitability of it is simply this. There is no specific gvul that can truly exist between Kodesh and Chol, for the simple reason that there cannot really be a gvul that exists to keep HaKadosh Baruch Hu out of the world sufficiently that there should be no Midas Hadin in the world? No. So how much Midas Hadin in the world? Well, Allah b'machshava levrasme Midas Hadin. This is all that Nadav and Avihu were doing, after all, according to the Zohar. They wanted to be makriv to Midas Hadin, the ultimate Bereshis bara Elohim. But is there a way to create a mechitza between Yesh and Ayin? You know what the mechitza between Yesh and Ayin is? It's a sukkah b'sachakol. That's the base of Bereshit that draws from Ayin into Yesh. That sure is not much of a sukkah, not much of a mechitza. And yet its mechitzas are learned from the Mishkan, from the Mikdash, as the Gemara tells us in Sukkah. And the reason for that is very simple. This is the reason that the Arizal was b'chadish the entire idea of the Teres at Tzimtzumim, which Baruch was mitzamtzem by evacuating space, ki'ilu, so that there should be a place for Nivrei, because if Melo Chol Haaretz Kvodo, so where is there place for anything else if Melo Chol Haaretz Kvodo? How could something which is only becoming and never truly being, and which is always totally dependent on the underlying nature of Yesh, how could it possibly exist in the presence of true Yesh? It's exactly the problem of what would I be worth in the presence of Moshe Rabbeinu? As Rish Lakish is saying, it's a good thing that there's death in the world. Yeah, but how would that death, Chas v'Shalom, be applied to HaKadosh Baruch Hu? But one moment. The Simcha of HaKadosh Baruch Hu also is not Mamtenes. Whoa. So what does that mean? That Avelus now becomes a quality. Yes, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is Misabel Alolomo. Vayinochem Hashem. That was Nechumim. Woo. Reason being because that aspect of Avelus and Nechumim is an expression of an innate paradox. That innate paradox means there will never, and Shlomo Melech says this when he's building, he says, I don't know how this is supposed to work. It's ridiculous. I understand, so I'm building a bias for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. What does that mean? And if the bias is as big as the cosmos, then it doesn't make sense. Of course not. The whole thing makes no sense. So the idea of tzimtzum is a constant work at maintaining what isn't really an existential fact that there really and truly is a mokum ponui kabayachal of kvod shamai. So therefore, the moment that Moshe Rabbeinu hears the words, "V'nikdash b'chvodi," he says, "What? You're telling me that the kvod shamayim is, if the kvod shamayim is going to be in this mishkan, then you know what happens? It keeps expanding. That's what happens. What keeps it in place? So what happens is, sevivav nisara ma'od. I'll tell you what keeps it in place. What keeps it in place is the fact that people don't see it. Essentially, that's what keeps it in place. In other words, the making it impossible in an olam, where the very word olam means ha'alama, keep things from people. How do we live our lives in the face of death? HaKadosh Baruch Hu is malim de yom hamisa from a person. He lives as if he's going to live forever. He keeps putting things into a life which are a joke because they're going to be here and gone in a flash. Why bother? That same ha'alama is the nature of the ha'alama of the fact that there couldn't be anything real that would be here if it's in the presence of the true Yeshus, from which the very ayin that gives birth to our Yeshus is derived. Okay, so we have one central paradox, but we're blinded. So it's the blindness that allows us to continue. As you get closer and closer, sevivav nisara ma'od, around that tzaddik who is makir more and more deeply the reality of the Ein Od Milvadai, then the very fact that he has a place to exist becomes more and more of a shocking thing. For an Adam Arishon, elements of Lo Yitboshashu is horrific. Do you not understand that you exist right on the edge? That there is such a profound vulnerability to your belief that your existence is a given on some level in the presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu? Do you not understand how totally vulnerable that existence is? That it's built on the same idea of Chashmal itself, itim choshos, itim amalawes, the oscillations of a virtuality that the instant they become, they disappear in the presence of truth. This is the nature of Mishkan, and this is the nature of the existence even of a particular organism in the presence of the totality of the information that makes that organism a thing, a vector. It's good that we can forget that. It's good that we don't look at things from the point of view of, what am I really? We don't look at things from the point of view of the information that's within us. And that allows us to be us, because there could be no ha'alama of Yom HaMisa if we did that, because that would be the whole point. There's the asek in the reproduction that allows us, and that of course is the bris milah, is the choosing, the determination, where it is that should continue to go. Well, that, by the way, explains the entire idea of post-coital sadness. That's exactly the point. A person post-coital sadness. After intercourse, people get sad. They get sad because they're involved in something which is by definition a commitment to their own demise. They understand that this is what I'm doing. I'm being osek in the continued development of a world which is built on my not being here, and the need to replace myself and to dedicate myself and my whole life to this information. I got time for these kids. I got money for these kids. But there is nothing else. There won't be anything else but these kids. So as crazy it is for the point of view of me as an organism and believing that I have a right to life, what can we do? This is what existence is about. An amazing thing. But what this means is the closer you get, the closer does the mechitza disappear. The thinner and thinner the mechitza gets, right? Because basically, the all, the reality, the yesh, the totality of the information is constantly on its way to actually flooding the entirety of that reality. So that when Rabbi Shimon says, look, Abbas of Adam, what does he know? He's got this big distance of the whole Ben Hashmashas. He lights his candles 40 minutes before Shkia, 18 minutes before Shkia. It's a joke. He doesn't even know when Shkia is Shkia. What is Shkia? Tchilat Shkia, some Shkias. Tzais, Rabbeinu Tam, it's a joke. The whole thing's a joke. He plays with time as if there's a real mechitza there. No one really knows nothing about it. If he really knew the verifying, what would he do? How could he deal with that? He can't deal with that. But when you're coming to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, it's not simply that it appears, because as far as the Adam is concerned, that's the reality. And that reality ate up Nadav Avihu. Because the presence of the Yesh is always a calculus that is approaching zero. It's approaching you. It's getting closer and closer and closer. The more you provide a place for an understanding of that thing, which was the horrible mistake that was made by Nadav Avihu, to try to deal with the essence of Midas Hadin, to be able to be aimed on a Chut HaSara, which end up being Sivavni Sarah Ma'od, and that Sarah destroyed them. And in that they were makrif to Midas Hadin, and in fact, in doing that, they became so karov that they became the korban, which is the hakrova itself, which is meant to be done by the Eish on the Mizbeach, not by the machshav, the person who understands too much. So indeed, v'nikdash b'chodi, the very fact that it's paradoxical, as creation is paradoxical, because if absolute existence is presence, there's no room for the virtual. There's no room in the presence of kvodi. What protects anything outside? And that's why Bnei Yisrael said, it's a disaster. We can't have this thing here. It's like having a naked singularity in the middle of the mountain. I understand. Anybody who gets too close gets swallowed up. What are we supposed to do? Not think anymore? Not care anymore? Like we did with the poor Tinok that understood the Chashmal. So the Gemara said maybe we should indeed Aser learn it. It was Havamina. Let's Aser learn Yechezkel. Says the Gemara, how many kids are going to understand? You lose a kid here and there, But it's not enough to Aser learning Yechezkel. I mean, it's an amazing thing because that's exactly what we understand. If you understand, you have created a kirva. That kirva allows loose the energies that are going to end up getting closer and closer as you understand more and more, until eventually, inevitably, they will destroy you. Because there is always going to be that impossible point, which I cannot be mavdil more about. And therefore, says Moshe, look, I was convinced that me or you, we were the ones that were going to be at that point, the most korov. That was the one that was going to get it, because there was no way to avoid it, because it is inevitable, because it is astounding that there would be no way to avoid this unless we artificially stop being human. We stop caring. We stop being doresh. We stop looking to understand, which is Sioni, doresh ema. The whole point is the drisha, to be able to have a Beis HaMikdash. So what are we supposed to do? Not be doresh. That itself is why he was absolutely convinced, and of course the ultimate power of the Havchana of Midas Hadin is smell. And that's why Mashiach is Murach V'doin, because smell is the direct perception of the existence of something else in a way that requires not understanding, but an actual neuronal qualia in which I see, the way I can see the color red, I could smell this guitarist. I could smell any other person. If I'm sensitive enough, I will be able to distinguish every other organism on earth the way a dog can. That's crazy. So the Murach V'doyin to take the Keteres and to use that as the mocker for Hakrova to Midas Adin becomes now the paradoxical nature of the Keteres itself, in which the Keteres, everybody says, oh my God, it must be poisonous every time somebody uses it. And on the contrary, it was Oitzer the Mageva and became the gift of the Malach HaMoves directly to Moshe Rabbeinu at Har Sinai. Lakachta Matanot Ba'adam. So there is nothing that is a direct perception of something, which is why it is so amazingly powerful to us, to our zichronos, to our reconstruction of something that otherwise would be merely intellectual, as that. So at least we begin to understand the power of this paradox. Is there anything to do? Is there, in fact, a response? Well, there's a remez to a response, yes. What's amazing is that there is a response that is exactly a mirror image of the nature of this paradox. And that response is surprisingly the way that Chazal, the way the Pasuk basically explains it. At la'asid lavai, nature of our relationship to Teva, is the v'harikoti lachem beracha ad b'li dai, which Chazal explain as meaning ad shivlu siftotechem milomar dai. Okay. Childishly, people assume, what does that mean? It means, wow, things will be so great when we're so overwhelmed. We're going to say, oh, Ribbon Shalom, oh, it's the same, not enough already. I mean, we don't deserve this, but etc., etc. Right? The problem, of course, is that if that is what it was to mean, it would be a reconstruction of Kaf Aleim Har Chagigis in the response that Moshe Rabbeinu says to them after 40 years. To say die is to say no, don't be no things. I'm just saying I believe die is the solution to the problems of Maimon Har Sinai, which create the issue of die in the first place. If we analyze the idea of what die means, it's actually the exact opposite of that idea. It's the exact opposite of Kriyat Tova. Kriyat Tova seeks to preserve the given, entitled, self as is. Because that type of self, the presence of Tova, is undesirable because it is real. And because it is real, it's extremely threatening. And that's the way the Maharal understands it. The Kaf Aleim Har Chagigis, the thing that was so powerful about it was the fact that Torah was so real that it was inevitable. But if it's so real that it's inevitable, then what's the space for the entitled me? Die, which is saying, I need nothing else but this second. If the entire universe had existed for this second, I wouldn't have thought that anything more could possibly be given. This is the most perfect possibility. Why do you say die? Because instead of attempting to preserve self, the die seeks to preserve the teva, not the me. It seeks to preserve the teva and to turn that teva into nitzchias, as a moment that is forever and ever and ever, rather than risk its misappropriation by an identity that doesn't recognize the utter surprise of existing within that framework, that allows this teva to be experienced, that may for a moment not be mitboshesh on the fact that this thing exists, and say, yes, this is wonderful, and not realize, yes, this is wonderful. How could this next moment be yours? Where would it come from? Where's the busha? How is it that you don't recognize this is so incredible? Where could someone like me ever have been socha to such an instant of nitzchias? The risk of that, I don't please. This is so perfect. Don't ruin it by adding anything else. What do you mean ruin it? Because I know I can ruin it. So it becomes the exact opposite response. The Vayidaim Arain touches on this die. Because what that die is the essence of that Vayidaim in every single instant of one's existence. The Vayidaim Aaron is a one-time thing in which the person says he's holding by death. Is he going to fight that? No. Even simple organisms have a neural response called Vayidaim. You take a look at an impala, which is at the neck. It has its neck in the mouth of a lion. It's completely at ease. It's completely relaxed. You said, that's a horrific thing. No. Complete and total relaxation. It's an amazing TED Talk about that guy. You should look it up because it's an unbelievable talk about a guy who works for emergency services, and he always is sent out to accidents. Usually first responders. And he says that for many years, if someone who was desperately injured asked him, do you think I'm going to make it? He would always say, yeah, you'll make it, even though he knew he wouldn't make it. Not hard to tell a guy, you're going to die 100%. What's the guy going to do? He says, at one time, he just couldn't bring himself to lie. I said, look, no one that has your injuries has ever survived. And I know. Probably not going to make it. 99.9%.
Matthew O'Reilly, Am I Dying? The Honest Answer.
Matthew O'Reilly. It's called Matthew. Am I Dying? Honest Answer. Okay, you look it up. Find it on TED Talks. And what he found was the most amazing thing. Every scene, because for the first time he saw it, he was so shocked, but he never lied again. They always told him every time someone was mocking that they were dying, they were completely bishlemus, totally calm. The exact opposite, and all they did was think over their lives, think about what they could have done otherwise, ask him to please remember them, talk to him about how did I waste my life like this, and so on. But complete and total shlemus. That's one level of Vayidaim. But what die is recognizing that every instant is like this, and that there is never a moment in which a person can have any sense of entitlement or believe that I'm taking this for myself. And that's the Veloyid Boshashu. The tikkun for Veloyid Boshashu is the constant surprise at existence and at the reality of what it is that being could possibly be in the presence of the non-being, which ought to be the given. So why indeed, if this is the solution, why indeed, one moment. Why indeed then is it so much of a paradox that we don't have a solution of learning to say die of Hivla? Why is this Stavka lost your love? That we say and here, I believe that the Nikuda is specifically in the words that are so much a part of this parsha, which is Nogea mamish, the problem of the nature of Busha and the idea of Mipnei Shamarti Davar Hagum Am Itztatzmi, and the fact that HaKadosh Baruch Hu was unable to be Mephias, the Yareach, which means that herein he's touching on that actual issue. There is a paradoxical reality that I cannot justify to you, because the more you understand, the more you should be manga. But that's of course what's happening over here. That Dorosh Darash, in terms of the Sorosh Rosh Chodesh, is essentially, there's a Kabbalah that the Ksiv of the Sefer Torah is meant to have Dorosh on the end of the line and Darash at the beginning of the next line. which indicates that what we're talking about is one Darosh is talking about the Drisha of all that took place until now, and it's the end of an element of Torah. And the other Darash is the beginning of something which seeks to end and to come to the tikkun, indeed, of the die. One is the direction of Yismach Hashem b'Ma'asav, going all the way back. And the other is in the direction of Ad Sheyivu Siftotechem Bilomar Dai. And the truth is that the amazing tikkun of Tisha B'Av, the Ashrei Adam B'Fachim Tamid, the tremendous Yakrus, which in the end becomes Esther, which Moshe is able to give through Mordechai to Esther. All of these things relate to the unbelievable fact that we have to knowingly enter into a Dorosh Darash Almenat King to recognize that the very Mesiras Nefesh Kavayach that HaKadosh Baruch Hu puts into my separations, in which he does not have answers to Mipnei Shamarti, in which he requires Kavayach a kapara, in which he engages in avelos, in which he Kavayach is mitzamtzem the mokam for Shemini, in which he can tell Avram Avinu, I didn't have any place in this world until you came along. This Hashem Amarta Yom Hashem Mirach Hayom. You need to be dedicated with that drisha. That drisha means to be derish my separations, to care about it, to love it. If you are going to be putting yourself into that place, then it's exactly the same as Moshe saying, Moshe, if you knew the Krovaya Kadesh and you said, I thought it would be either me or you, why didn't you just withdraw? Because I can't. Because this is what I'm here for. Because this is Bris Milah. Because this is what it means to be mashlim, the emunah that HaKadosh Baruch Hu put into the Elah. Because I share that emunah. You want to talk about the shutfis with my separations? It's going to kill you. Exactly. That's the shutfis. And that's why the Gemara says that the Adam is meant to be Oraim Bedas Kibehema. The Gemara says. Adam Uvehema Toshia Hashem, that deep interrelationship that would allow the Atzei Shitim Aimdin, that impact even Behema, can impact an Adam. That only an Adam who is naked to the world, which is the other meaning of Oraim, like the Behema is, who senses the direct chiyuvim and the direct presence of what he has to do without anything in between. The way you smell something, the way you see something, the way this color cannot be explained to anybody else who doesn't see it, and yet is the most intense, immediate of experiences. Give me that. Oh. Absolutely astounding. What is that? What is that quality that you see, that you could not tell anybody about, ever? That's the Shomer Mitzvah, Lo Yeda Davara. That's the Adam Kibehema, exactly. That's the difference between the Bilam, who separates himself from Behema, and Mamela uses Behema, and the Adam, who is carved in the Behema, and therefore is Karishemus on Behema, and therefore comes to understand his own Mokum in the world, is exactly that difference. And so the Mechitzas will converge on zero, and therefore they will converge on zero tolerance. The idea of this die, we gradually converge ourselves upon a solution that approaches zero of the totality of the interdependence of Vayikra on Vayikar, of the dependence on a Davar Hagun, on the Chiyum Metiatzmeh, on the dependence upon Simcha Shel Mitzvah, on the Simcha Mazosa, of the dependence of a phenotype on genotypes, of a dependence of Bria on Simpson, on the dependence of developing life, on death, on the dependence of Kedesh on Chol, on Shabbos of the totality of the Sheshes Yamim, on the paradoxes of Torah, on the Shochei Yitam B'Tov Tumasam, on the Yokar B'Lifnei Hashem HaMovsel HaChasidav is the Yokar. All must be knowingly entered into Almanas Kain, knowing that the need for this drisha may kill you. But it's the only way in which it's possible to have a bria, which in the end you will eventually break through, but not through a search for solutions for myself within the current reality. And therefore, in that sense, the most profound truth of the Mishkan is its ultimate place of Aveda. It's not simply that the creation of those bechitas that were niskala k'shakadosh baruch hu esadin im chasidav, so he's misala, and so that's true. But the very fact that we are ready to enter into this relationship, the understanding of what it means to be a shemer mitzvah yedadavara, the way in which we learn to engage without any thoughts of the ultimate consequences, the way in which we learn to define life as the shmira of that mitzvah. That is the gradual growth in a ben Adam who becomes the ultimate ima melech b'malachto yashav sham, the ultimate shmira of Shabbos and uniting the Yom HaShishi with vayachalalu b'Yom HaShvi, the only type of nivra that could possibly exist right there on the edge, where svivav nisara ma'od, and to be able to be a darash at the same time, so that ultimately every last aspect, not only of my separations, but of his own experience of what it is to exist, becomes ma'uchad in the harikos lachem bracha ad bli dai. Okay, you can turn this off. That's basically a brief description